So welcome everybody. I am Mayor Hodges, and I'm not what you were expecting to see or who you were expecting to see. We were hoping to have Ann Martin, who is the brilliant brainchild and historian, longtime Charlestown resident, behind the information that you're going to hear today. And hopefully you'll be able to share some perspective along the way. Because we wanted to have a conversation about history, and specifically about Black history in the city of Charlestown. So that's our goal today. History is the tie that binds us together. It's the stories that we tell that help us establish and maintain our sense of community, our sense of belonging, and understand where we came from and how we got there. But one thing that I'm always curious about, as a historian myself, is how we tell our stories. Not just what's in them, but how we choose the information that gets put forward. And so this week in Charlestown, we are celebrating our Founders Week. June of 1808, Charlestown officially became a city. And this week, we have a slew of activities planned to help us celebrate being a city and our founding of the city in June of 1808. But usually when we talk about Founders Day, who are the kinds of people we talk about? Who are our founders? I know some of y'all know. Who are the founders? Who? Jonathan Jennings, right? Jonathan Jennings. Who are we named after? Anybody know? Charles Beggs, right? If you drive up the Tunnel Mill, you hear about John Work, right? And then just on Main Street, one of the houses we toured last year, and last year's walking history was Thomas Downs, right? So these are the people that often get the credit. What do all those folks have in common? They are men. And what kind of men were they? Rich? Good. So they're rich men, and then what race? White, right? There's nothing wrong with that. These guys, I mean, they're to be celebrated for their successful bringing about of our city. We wouldn't be the city of Charlestown without their influence and their innovation and their insight. And so we definitely, want to acknowledge their contributions to history. But if we only ever focus on those men, if we only ever talk about them, we're overshadowing a lot of our history. And so one of my goals as mayor and as a historian is to, as we take our annual history tours during Founders Week, as we think about the types of monuments and memorials we want to put up, as I issue proclamations acknowledging different parts of our history, I always also want to look at and acknowledge the contributions from people who've been overshadowed in the past by those other characters in our founding. And so first and foremost, I think it's vital that we recognize that the founding of our city and the land that we sit on today was accomplished at the expense of indigenous people who originally called this land their home. I mean, we are sitting on indigenous land, and I think that's an important thing to acknowledge. The Shawnee, the Miami, other indigenous peoples and nations established communities here long before you or I ever sat here or came here or had the chance to do the things that we're doing. And so, much of what we have is a credit to them. We have also taken steps to make sure that women, especially an LGBT woman, was acknowledged by placing the Mary Garrett Hay marker up on the square. So if you haven't been up there to see that, that's a historical marker that we have added to draw attention to her activity as a suffragist and the contributions that she made. We often talk about her dad and her grandpa, but now we can talk about Mary Garrett Hay as well. And so as we looked at the history today of coming together, and I realized that the schedule was going to have our history component for Founders Week on Juneteenth, I thought, well, what a great opportunity to celebrate and talk about the contributions of our Black settlers and our residents all the way up through history. And so that's when I reached out to Ann. So we're here to talk about another part of that history today. Ann is a friend, a lifelong resident of Charlestown. I had the honor of getting to meet her mother several years ago for an oral history project that I was working on, and so I got to meet Penny and had wonderful conversations with Penny about what it was like growing up here, raising kids here, working at the ammunition plant when it was operational. Penny was elected as a union rep in a time when black women did not do such things. And so Penny was really a force all on her own. And Ann is right there carrying on her mother's legacy in helping do research and trying to help draw attention to the contributions of our black citizens. My only regret in our programming today is that Ann can't be with us here in person. Due to some health complications, she was unable to be here because she's the one that's supposed to be leading this. Mm-hmm. And so I feel like I would be remiss if I didn't acknowledge the fact that I'm sitting here as a white woman leading this conversation about black history in Charlestown. I am by no means an expert. I am who I am, but I am deeply passionate about bringing forward our stories. And so I'm glad and blessed that Ann has been able to help inform and lead this conversation. I'm just here as a person sharing her work. And so we're filming this so that Ann has a chance to participate and watch. And she truly has been a blessing in gathering this material. So today is Juneteenth, a long celebrated day in African American communities, recognized last year for the first time as a federal holiday. And we commemorate the day that this was the day, the anniversary of the time when the announcement and enforcement of emancipation reached one of the last slavery holdouts in Galveston, Texas on June 19th of 1865. You might be thinking, what in the world does an announcement about emancipation in Galveston, Texas in 1865 have anything to do with Charlestown history? But that's why we're here today, is to talk about how history is full of curves and twists and influences that sometimes we don't recognize right away, but really can have an impact, even from somewhere as far as away as Galveston to the city of Charlestown. So let me start with a question, because I like to be interactive and wanted this to be interactive. We were hoping to have an actual conversation, so let me just test your historical knowledge. And I know that not everybody likes history, and dates are one of those hard things to remember in history, but let me just start with a question, because this was something that we were all curious about. When were enslaved African Americans made free? When can we pinpoint a time where enslaved African Americans in our country were made free? And it's okay to not know, it's okay to guess, it's okay to throw things out. Wrong answers are not problematic, because that's where we have that rich conversation. So when were they made free? Yeah.
The ratification of the 13th Amendment.
Okay, so I hear ratification of the 13th Amendment. Other thoughts? 1863, okay, with January of 1863 with the proclamation.
Emancipation
Proclamation. Let me just throw some dates out for you. These are good answers, and they're not wrong. Thing is, they're both right. So let me throw out some dates for you. Emancipation Proclamation preliminary warning that Abraham Lincoln issued saying, hey, I'm going to do this if you don't shape up and free everybody, was done September 22nd of 1862. He followed through. On January 1st of 1863, he issued the Emancipation Proclamation, freeing the slaves in the Confederate States. Surrender of Confederate troops happened at Appomattox Courthouse on April 9th, 1865. Into the Civil War, right? News takes a while to travel.
2 years.
Yes, 2 years. So what about the surrender of the Western Confederate Army on the Trans-Mississippi on June 2nd of 1865? What about the day that General Order Number 3 was actually read in Galveston on June 19th, 1865, the formal commemoration of Juneteenth? But even after that, emancipation formalized in Delaware and in Kentucky with their ratification of the 13th Amendment, and that wasn't until December 18th of 1865. Surely that's it, right? No. Because there were still some Choctaw holdouts who had sided with the Confederacy who finally freed their remaining enslaved African Americans in 1866. So when we're talking about pinpointing a date of freeing enslaved African Americans, that's what I mean by those curves and twists in history. And so it gets really complicated when you're trying to narrow that down. It's really hard to pinpoint a specific date with that information. But what about slavery in Indiana? Surely that's a no-brainer, right? Was Indiana a slave state?
No.
Always? See, this is one of the first things. So many of you know that I wasn't born and raised in Indiana. I was actually born and raised mostly in Alabama. We moved around a lot when I was a kid. So I've lived in California, I lived in Kansas, I've lived in Georgia, I lived in Mississippi, and then finally landed in Charlestown, which I consider home because I've never known a place quite like Charlestown. But one of the first things as a student of history that I heard when I came here was, oh, well, Indiana was a slave state. And in my Alabama mind, anything north of the Ohio, right, was free. But it's not that easy here either. Because we know that it was tolerated and allowed before statehood. Slavery was tolerated and allowed before statehood. So in 1805 to 1809, abolitionists began to gain control of the governmental power in Indiana. And when they did, they started trying to set rules and overturn the laws that would allow slavery. But that doesn't mean that racist practices were not here. So when I throw out words like systematic racism, let me be clear. I'm not calling any individual person a racist. I'm saying that there were policies in place that systematically held back black people and still do. Okay? And that's why we have these conversations, to bring attention to them. They're not always easy conversations to have, but they're absolutely necessary. So, what about slavery in Indiana? Officially, in 1816, slavery was outlawed. But there's a way that they worked around that. Anybody have an idea?
Indentured servitude.
Yes, indentured servitude. So rather than call it slavery, they called it indentured servitude. And the idea was that eventually they would get free, but that wasn't the way it worked in reality. So after a while, even that was outlawed. But again, it's more complicated than that, because black settlers living in Charlestown and throughout Clark County had a whole lot of other challenges that white settlers didn't have. Now, we could get into the nuances and talk about poverty any day, anytime. But we're not talking about just poverty today. We're not talking about poor white people. We're not talking about the challenges they faced. We're talking about the challenges that black settlers in Charlestown faced simply because they had black skin, dark skin, brown skin, just because they looked a certain way. And here are some of those challenges. Even when slavery was outlawed, even when indentured servitude was outlawed, if you were black in Clark County, you had to pay a $500 bond, which in the 1800s, can you imagine? I didn't go look up and do the math, but imagine. Yeah, it may as well be $1 million today, right? A $500 bond just for being black in Clark County. Thank you, hon. And that was to ensure your good behavior. That's that racist system we talk about, where inherently, if you were a black person, they assumed that you were going to be on bad behavior. And so that $500 bond was to ensure you wouldn't. I can't imagine having to come up with that amount of money back then. And that lasted for quite a while. Also, even though slavery was outlawed and indentured servitude wasn't allowed, simply walking around in Clark County or Charlestown in the 1800s put you at risk. Because in 1850, there was the Fugitive Slave Law. And the Fugitive Slave Law meant that people could come and capture you, and you were not allowed to testify on your own behalf. Not allowed to testify on your own behalf. Can you imagine that in the United States of America? Yeah, you can. Yeah. And that's why we're here, because there's a whole lot of people that look like me who can't. Imagine that. So, when you look at the numbers, there was actually a decline in our population around that period. Now, I can't pinpoint I can't say beyond a shadow of a doubt that that's why, right? But the correlation is pretty clear. If you couldn't prove that you weren't a slave and you weren't allowed to testify, and Indiana upheld the fugitive slave law, then guess what? You were at risk of being separated from your family, of being sent to a place where you didn't know anyone, and not being allowed to get back. Right?
Right. Because there was no fact that people would come from another, down south, come up north, and claim that you were a slave, even though you weren't, and you would be going back
Yes.
down south
Yes.
and be a slave.
Yes. So unless there was a local white family who was willing to stand up and say, no, I know them. They're not. Or unless you had somehow been able to get into the business, the business world or whatever, like some people were able to do, you were on your own, So these are the complicated part of that history that I wanted to make sure that we talked about. Even in areas where free black families could settle, they face these types of policies. So Civil War, we've talked about all the dates of emancipation. Obviously the fugitive slave law went away after emancipation was achieved, these types of things. But it didn't immediately get better. And again, there was a lot of those feelings of hatred and accusations and cruelty. So in 1871, in November, something tragic happened right here in our community. And for the first time this year, the Indiana State Senate acknowledged this tragedy. Now, this is the part where I have to own who I am and what I look like and make sure that I'm not using words or language that can be triggering, harmful. And so I'm going to use the word murdered rather than a word that starts with L because of that acknowledgement, okay? But there are details to be had about the event that I'm about to discuss. So on a November night in 1871, 3 black men incorrectly, falsely accused of murdering a white family were housed in the Charlestown jail just a few blocks from here. And on that night, a mob of angry white men broke into the jail. And I mean broke into the jail. I have read the account of the reporter who was there that night, and you can read it too. It's in the library, in the back section of our Charlestown library, and the librarians can help you, direct you to that, and you can read it. But I want to issue a word of caution. It's a very emotional read because it's a first-hand account of the reporter who was there with these men when this happened. But he goes into very big detail about how hard they worked to break into this jail to get these 3 men out. And they got them out. And they murdered them in probably one of the most violent and disgusting ways that they could have murdered them. Humiliation along the way, only because they were black. They were not guilty. There was not enough evidence to even suggest that they were guilty. That was just pure hatred. The Indiana Senate has acknowledged this, and Anne was pivotal in making that happen, and that's why I really wish she could be here with us today. But the Indiana Senate also gave Anne and myself as mayor a original signature sealed copy, with the state seal copy of this resolution. And I didn't bring it because it's not framed yet. And I didn't want to risk marring it I didn't want, outside, you don't know what's going to happen. And so it's in my office, and if anybody ever wants to see it, just contact me and we'll make sure that you get a chance to come up and see it. But we're going to have it framed and hung up in City Hall. But that kind of reparative action is needed. Drawing attention to it is needed, as uncomfortable as it is. And we're working to try to find a location and get a permanent marker placed to acknowledge the tragedy of those men's lives. And I feel it's important that we understand their names. George Johnson, Squire Taylor, Charles Davis. These are the men who were unjustly murdered after being accused of that crime. And here's another feature of this sort of erasure and challenge that we try to deal with when we're trying to talk about these histories. We don't know where they were buried. We know that there was a section of the Charlestown Cemetery that was dedicated for black individuals to be buried. Unfortunately, Most of the time those were wood markers, and over time they've deteriorated, so we don't know for sure where they were buried. We also know that there were sections of the cemetery hill here on this hill where many black residents lived, and they may be there. So we're trying to do some more research, trying to find out where the most logical place is to place a monument, and when we get that done, we'll be taking an initiative. And I've already had outreach from a history teacher at Charlestown High School who wants his class to help with this, with raising money, with finding details, with figuring this out, because this is important to our history and we want to acknowledge it. So I don't want to just talk about those things. That's heavy. That's some heavy stuff to take in, y'all. And it's hard to hear. There's so many other good things about Charlestown too, and we want to make sure we're talking about those. That was very important to Ann, because if you sit and talk to Ann for a while, you'll hear all kinds of stories. She's just like Penny. Penny would sit and tell stories her mother forever and ever. And we do know from records in the 1890s that black residents were extremely active in our community, in church groups and fraternal organizations and other community groups where they got together and created a culture for themselves here unique to Charlestown. And they did a lot of benevolent good works. So we know these things. And although schools were segregated for a long time, Charlestown schools integrated before they were forced to from the Brown v. Board decision. And so that was Ann's school. That's where Ann grew up. Ann is 70 years old. She was born in 1952, and she remembers growing up in schools that were integrated. She has friends today that spent the night, white friends that grew up with her grandma, that raised her and spent the night at their house, as she called it, the Sugar Shack, here in the area where many black residents settled, in what this area is where we sit. This used to be called Pleasant Run Community, the original name. Ann just calls it the Hill. Okay. But she has these memories. So in a time when Ann could not go across the river and enter Fountain Ferry Park, she could swim in the swimming pool in the city of Charlestown. And her brothers could play Little League on the integrated Little League team. So in that way, Charlestown is unique. And Ann wants that celebrated. She wants to draw attention to that. She says she never felt isolated, ostracized, abused, or mistreated growing up here in Charlestown. So much of that ugly history, because of the persistence and resiliency of our black families that were here, Ann was able to have a different kind of life. She recalled for me one of her favorite memories. This is where I really wish she was here to tell this. She recalled for me one of her favorites, and some of y'all may remember this. I'm seeing some faces that might remember this. So in the 1980s, something tried to happen up on the square. Do you remember? Clara just had a nod. Do you remember this, Clara? Yeah. So in the 1980s, the Ku Klux Klan decided they were going to come to Charlestown for a rally. They made it about as far as the traffic light coming up onto the square before an entire mob of mostly white Charlestown people said, no, get out. And Ann remembers that vividly. And she said it was so affirming for her. Ellen, you remember too? Yeah. And so she remembers vividly being so proud of her community to say, no, not here. We're not doing that. So where historically an angry mob wreaked irreparable damage on families and murdered 3 men, in the 1980s, another angry white mob did not get a chance to do those kinds of things, not even to say their hateful speech, because Charlestown rallied and got them out. And Ann thought that was really important. These memories of Charlestown are heartwarming, and they're shared by many in our community, but we can't grow complacent with them. It's easy to celebrate those good things and to draw attention to them, but we have a wonderful city. We're welcoming, we're growing, we're seeing more diversity than we have in the past. And lots of people say that's a good thing. And I agree. But we have to remind ourselves of the things that we can always continue to do better. And we have to look at ourselves and say, where does our privilege exist? And how do we always acknowledge that as we grow and welcome new families here? Take, for example, the land we're sitting on. Greenway Park. It's a beautiful park, and I'm particularly proud of the stream we have running through it, and we're working to bring some enhancements It needs a little update, some new playground equipment, and our guys work hard mowing the grass. There's lots of events that happen down here, and of course, if you've seen it at Christmas, then you've seen a real special treat. We're very proud of our park. This park wasn't always here. This park was dedicated, there's a marker right there, so before you leave, if you haven't ever seen it, I encourage you to stop and read it. The black marker that's kind of facing away onto the path, not the time capsule one with the funky cube on the thing, but the other one. That marker tells you that this park was dedicated to Richard and Fannie Green, thus Greenway Park, and all of their descendants in recognition for their service to the community. The Greens were a prominent black family who settled on this spot in the late 1890s. So a lot of that history I was talking about, they were here for that. In fact, lots of other black families settled in this area, and where we sit, there once were houses. And I was talking to Miss Regina, and I was talking to Ellen, and they remember those houses. They remember seeing those houses when they were here. You remember, Ann? Yeah, Claire, you guys remember. So there were houses here. And when Ann Martin talked to me about living in the sugar shacks in the community on the hill, this is what she was talking about. So this entire area comprised a thriving black community, full of culture and people sitting on the porches and waving at you as you came by, as you were walking around in the downtown area. In the 1960s, that changed because the city chose to participate in the federal urban renewal program, designed to remove blighted areas that had been designated as slums. And I'm using this language on purpose because that's the language that was in the program.
Could you repeat the term that you said initially?
Urban renewal. Urban renewal. Blighted areas. Slums. That's how it was described. Blighted. And Charlestown recently has heard those terms in another issue that we won't get into today. But those are the terms that are often used. They're loaded terms. And one of the outcomes of that urban renewal that was designed to bring businesses thriving back to our community was the displacement of many of our black families. The removal of many of our black families. And so I think you have to address those correlations. We're looking at booming growth again. We have announced over the past couple of months new stores, new housing communities, new industrial growth, new areas for shops and retail. Our schools are working to improve and they're investing money in our schools. We're going to get a brand new school right up here by Jonathan Jennings School in the next few years. So we're growing because the secret's out. Our community is a really great place to be. But as we grow, we have to grow ethically. And if we forget our history, then we risk repeating the mistakes of our past. And so it's important to understand the impact of urban renewal on the families that were here. In doing some of the research, 71 homes, conservatively 33 families, but more than that. Because what would happen is just because one person owned the land, like the Green family, there might have been multiple families living on that one piece of property. But as much as 15% of our already small African American community was removed in urban renewal when it happened in the 60s. Those are the types of mistakes we don't want to make again. Because what we do know is that diversity is a strength. It's a welcome thing. And it helps communities grow and thrive, and that's where we want to be. So this week, I want you to come celebrate our events. We have flyers here that show all the different events. We're excited about being the city of Charlestown. It's a wonderful place to be. We have all kinds of events, from a teen night with gaming and bounce houses and obstacle courses. We have a family night with the same types of things. We have our ice cream social on Wednesday night with good gospel music and singing. We have a trivia night. We have a car show and a concert and a balloon glow. We have a lot going on this week, folks. It is a time of celebration, and I want to stress that. Today is a day for our black community to celebrate the emancipation, despite what date we actually want to give it to it. It is a day of celebration. But my call to you is to take action to learn about our history as well. History can be fun. I hope that you'll visit our library. I hope that you'll ask the reference librarians for that Indiana collection, and you'll go back there and you'll tell them, all you have to do is tell them the topic you want, and they will help you find stuff. They are eager to help you find stuff, and you can read some of the accounts that Ann and I have used to reinforce this conversation or this narrative. I also hope that we will appreciate our sometimes complicated history, and that the more we learn about it, the better able we are to welcome diversity here in Charlestown. And I also want to take it one step further, because I'd be remiss if I just talked about this and didn't give you an action step. I want you to find and shop at a Black-owned business this week. I want you to spend your money with Black-owned companies. And we have one coming to Charlestown, so I'm going to make it a little bit easy on you. If you come to our Balloon Glow, Winks Ice Cream is a Black-owned business, and they will be setting up at our big Founders Day wrap-up event on the 25th, this coming Saturday, for the Balloon Glow. And I want you to come buy ice cream from them, because that's important. If you like popcorn, they're not going to be here for us this time, but if you like popcorn, there's the popcorn. What's the name of it? Just Poppin' Flavors. I knew I'd get there. Black-owned, okay? And there's a whole list.
Charlestown Road.
Yes. And if you want more, the Southern Indiana Takeout Facebook page has a whole list of Black-owned restaurants that you can hit up this week as you dine. Because I think we need to take those steps.
Mm-hmm.
It's through the remembering, it's through the monuments, it's through the creation, it's through spending our money in these targeted ways that people like me can help, and all of us can help repair some of those damages of the past. And so these are the things that Ann and I sat together with over the past 8 months or so, and wanted to help bring forward as we talk about history in Charlestown this week and acknowledge our founding and how rich that founding truly is. Mm-hmm. I'm happy to try to answer any additional questions or to just open it up for perspective. I think hearing from you is a rich part of this as well. Some of you have memories of the things I discussed, and perhaps some of this is new to some of you, and that's okay too. So it's entirely yours now.
I think you left out the fact that we also had one of the first integrated Boy Scout troops in southern Indiana, Troop 66, which was in Charlestown at the old Presbyterian Church. Now deceased Senator Jim Lewis was our scoutmaster, and we were the first integrated Boy Scout troop, I think, in southern Indiana, and I still have lifelong friendships from that scout troop.
So definitely. So in addition to the swimming pool and the Little League that we talked about, the Boy Scout troop, I did forget the Boy Scouts, so I'm glad you mentioned that.
And thanks for sharing your history with us.
Thank you, Ann.
Thank you,
Thank you so much, Ann.
Thank you, Ann. We wish you could have been here to tell your story. Thank you.